They called them tin cans. Fragile, undergunned, and expendable. Destroyers that were never meant to duel with cruisers, let alone heavy ones. But in April 1940, one British destroyer would defy that logic entirely. Outnumbered, outgunned, and already burning, HMS Glowworm turned her broken hull toward the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and rammed her. It was supposed to be suicide. Instead, it became one of the most astonishing acts of courage in naval history. In the early months of 1940, the German Kriegsmarine had a phrase for British destroyers, Blechbüchsen, tin cans. It wasn't meant as an insult. It was a statement of fact. Small, thin-skinned ships of barely 2,400 tons, armed with 4.7-inch guns that could barely scratch a cruiser's paint. Against Germany's heavy cruisers like Admiral Hipper, displacing over 10 times their weight and firing 8-inch armor-piercing shells, the odds were absurdly one-sided. Naval doctrine agreed. Destroyers screened for capital ships, cruisers hunted destroyers, and battleships ruled over all. That was how naval hierarchies worked. Neat, mathematical, predictable. But war rarely stays within the lines drawn by textbooks, because beneath the calculations and doctrine, there are moments when a commander must decide to obey logic or to defy it. The Royal Navy's destroyers were built for speed, not slugging matches. They were meant to strike from the shadows, launch torpedoes, and vanish into the mist. They were never supposed to trade blows with a ship that could sink them with a single broadside. Yet in April 1940, one destroyer, HMS Glowworm, would find herself alone, out of position, and face to face with one of the most powerful warships in the German fleet. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Gerard Rupp, would have seconds to choose between retreat and defiance. The Germans laughed when they called British destroyers tin cans. But in the freezing waters off Norway, they would learn that sometimes, even a tin can bite through steel. Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Rupp wasn't a man who sought heroism. At 35, he'd spent most of his life in the Royal Navy, steady, competent, and respected. He wasn't the kind of officer who delivered grand speeches or craved medals. He was the kind who followed orders, looked after his crew, and made the right decisions quietly. In early April 1940, his ship, HMS Glowworm, was part of the first destroyer flotilla, operating from Scapa Flow in the bleak northern reaches of Scotland. Their mission was routine, to escort convoys, lay mines along the Norwegian coast, and patrol the iron routes that fed Germany's war machine. It was the kind of thankless, grinding work destroyer crews came to know well: endless gray horizons, bitter winds, and the constant roar of the North Sea. But that week, something was different. British intelligence had begun intercepting fragments of German communications. There was movement, large-scale, coordinated, and ominous. The Kriegsmarine was preparing for something big. No one yet knew it was Operation Weserübung, the full-scale invasion of Norway and Denmark. On April 6th, Glowworm set out with HMS Renown and other destroyers to lay mines near Vestfjord, north of Trondheim. The seas were already turning violent. Spray froze on railings and visibility dropped to yards. Even standing on deck was dangerous. One wrong step, and the sea could claim you in an instant. By April 7th, the storm was at its peak. Waves crashed over the bow like walls of black glass, and the ship rolled so hard that every unsecured object became a weapon. Somewhere amid that chaos, fate made its first move. A sailor was swept overboard. One moment he was there, the next gone into the freezing gray. The shout came instantly, "Man overboard!" Every man on deck froze. In those temperatures, a human body had minutes at most. 6 degrees Celsius water meant hypothermia in 10 minutes, unconsciousness in 15. The sea didn't forgive mistakes out here. Rupp faced a choice no commander ever wants. Do you hold formation, protecting your mission and your fleet, or turn back, alone, into a storm that could tear your ship apart, to search for one man you'll probably never find? Doctrine was clear. You stay with the fleet. The mission always came first. But Rupp didn't hesitate. He ordered Glowworm to turn around. The destroyer heeled over into the wind, her bow smashing through monstrous waves, searchlights cutting through sheets of rain. For hours the crew scanned the black water, eyes straining, voices hoarse from shouting into the storm. They found nothing. Only the merciless sea. By dawn, April 8th, the reality was clear. The man was gone, claimed by the North Sea. Roop gave the order to abandon the search and rejoin the fleet. But the storm had pushed Glowworm far off course, scattered, alone, and now dangerously close to Norwegian waters. He didn't know it yet. But that single act of humanity, turning back for a lost sailor, had placed his ship directly in the path of the German invasion force. At 8 a.m., lookouts sighted two dark shapes emerging through the fog ahead. Warships. The silhouettes were sharp and modern, long, lean destroyers flying the German naval ensign. Bound von Arnim and 18 Hans Lüdemann. Both were part of the escort for the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. Roop didn't know that. Not yet. He saw only two enemy destroyers steaming fast, closing in. He ordered battle stations. Sirens wailed through the ship and men sprinted to their posts. Gun crews loaded shells. Torpedo men checked firing circuits. Then came the moment that would decide everything. To engage or to run. Roop knew he couldn't outrun both. But he also knew this sighting meant something vital. The Germans were here, in force. That intelligence alone could alter British strategy across Norway. He ordered his radio operator to transmit, "Enemy destroyers sighted. Position 64 degrees north, 5 degrees east," the message went out. The Kriegsmarine would now know they'd been discovered. The German destroyers opened fire first. Water erupted around Glowworm, plumes of spray rising taller than her masts. The British guns roared back, 4.7-inch shells spitting orange fire into the gray. It was a running battle, violent and chaotic, the kind of close-range, high-speed dual destroyer crews trained for, but rarely survived. Roop maneuvered brilliantly, using smoke and sharp turns to throw off German aim. The sea itself seemed to join the fight. Spray, fog, and waves breaking visibility with every roll. For 20 furious minutes, Glowworm fought two enemies alone in the storm. Then as the smoke cleared, Roop saw something else through the haze. A new silhouette, vast and towering. Not a destroyer. Not even close. It was Admiral Hipper, and HMS Glowworm, the tin can, had just stumbled upon a steel monster. The gray wall of steel loomed through the mist like something alive. Admiral Hipper, a German heavy cruiser, 14,000 tons of armor, firepower, and cold precision. Her guns, 8 8-inch monsters housed in 4 twin turrets, could hurl 270-pound shells over 16 miles. Her armor belt was thicker than Glowworm's entire hull plating, and she was fast, capable of 32 knots, her turbines humming with mechanical confidence. In that instant, Lieutenant Commander Roop understood the truth. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Every piece of naval logic said the same thing. Run. But running was pointless. In these seas, in this visibility, Admiral Hipper could still overtake her prey with ease. There was nowhere to go. The first salvo came from over 10,000 yards. A sound like tearing sky, followed by columns of water towering above Glowworm's deck. The next volley walked closer. The third found the range. An 8-inch shell ripped through Glowworm's forward section, detonating in a shower of fire and steel. The blast tore through bulkheads, killing men instantly. Another shell smashed a gun mount clean off the deck. The destroyer shuddered, bleeding smoke and flame. Roop stayed on the bridge, his uniform streaked with soot, giving orders through the chaos. He had no illusions left, only instincts. "If he couldn't win, he'd make the enemy bleed trying. Engage main guns," he shouted. "Target the superstructure." Glowworm's 4.7-inch guns barked defiantly, small bright flashes against the vast silhouette ahead. Shells struck Hipper's hull and bridge, clanging harmlessly off armor, but a few found their mark. One exploding near the forward gun crew, another shattering equipment on her upper decks. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then Roop gave another order. "Torpedoes! Stand by to fire!" The destroyer's 10 torpedo tubes were her only real weapons capable of killing something that size. Each fish carried a 750-pound warhead, enough to cripple even a cruiser if it struck true. The order went out. The crew steadied themselves on the pitching deck, sights flicking across a target so large it filled their vision. Glowworm fired. A fan of white wakes streaked across the water, racing toward the Hipper. For a heartbeat, hope flickered. Then the cruiser turned hard to port, smoothly, deliberately. Her captain, Kapitän zur See Helmut High, had seen the launch in time. The torpedoes missed, slicing harmlessly past her stern. Roop's one chance was gone. Admiral Hipper's guns roared again. Shells tore into the glowworm, opening gaping wounds in her hull. Fires raged uncontrolled. Men screamed below decks, trapped behind twisted steel. The ship's speed faltered. 30 knots became 25, then 20. Still, Roop fought. Still, he refused to break contact. He ordered a new course, toward the enemy. Even as shells exploded around him, even as fire licked up the bridge, Roop's voice was calm. "Helm, bring her about." The helmsman stared for half a second. Then he nodded and turned the wheel. There was only one thing left to do. If he couldn't sink Hipper with torpedoes, he would ram her. It was a decision born not of madness, but of logic twisted by circumstance. Glowworm was dying. She'd never survive another broadside. But if she could drive her bow into Hipper's side, the impact might cause real damage, enough to cripple the cruiser, maybe even force her out of the campaign. Full speed ahead. Roop ordered. The engineers below, sweating amid flames and choking smoke, pushed the turbines to their limit. The destroyer surged forward, broken, burning, and unstoppable. Aboard Admiral Hipper, alarm bells rang. German sailors shouted, pointing through the smoke as the small British destroyer charged straight toward them. "Rammen! Sie will rammen!" "She's going to ram!" Captain High shouted for emergency maneuvers. The cruiser began to turn, her massive hull rolling sluggishly. But she was too large, too slow. Glowworm was coming fast, 30 knots, closing the distance in seconds. Admiral Hipper's secondary batteries opened fire. 4-inch guns, 37mm autocannons, everything they had. The air filled with tracers and flame. Men died on Glowworm's decks, ripped apart by shells and shrapnel. The bridge was hit again. Roop was wounded, but he stayed upright, gripping the rail, eyes fixed on the looming shape ahead. He shouted one last order, "Steady as she goes!" The bow of Glowworm struck Admiral Hipper's starboard side with a sound like the earth breaking open. Steel met steel. The destroyer's anchor bit deep into the German hull, tearing a long, jagged wound. For a moment, both ships were locked together, shrieking metal, spraying steam, explosions echoing across the sea. Then they tore apart. Glowworm's bow was gone, crushed flat, her hull buckled and flooding fast. But Hipper was wounded too. A 130-foot gash ran along her starboard side below the waterline. Compartments flooded instantly. Her list grew, 5 degrees, then 7. The tin can had drawn blood. Roop's ship was finished. Fire engulfed her from bow to stern, explosions rocking her as the sea poured in. At 09:25, he gave the order to abandon ship. Men stumbled to the rails, jumping into the freezing water. Many were already too weak, too wounded, or too cold to survive more than minutes. Roop stayed until the end. When the order was carried out, Glowworm was listing heavily, her stern lifting as the sea swallowed her. At 09:30, she capsized and sank, her propellers still spinning as the North Sea closed over her. Silence followed. Smoke, fire, and wreckage drifted on the waves. Above it all, the German heavy cruiser, scarred, listing, and stunned, came to a halt. Captain Hay stood on the bridge, watching the spot where Glowworm had vanished. He could have steamed on, left the British sailors to die in the icy water. That's what the war demanded. Instead, he gave a different order. Heave to. Begin rescue operations. And as the crew of Admiral Hipper threw ropes and lifeboats to their enemies, the legend of HMS Glowworm and her commander who refused to surrender began to take shape in the freezing gray dawn. The sea was merciless that morning. Waves rolled across the wreckage, black and heavy, scattering debris, planks, helmets, twisted steel. Among it floated the men of HMS Glowworm, hundreds at first, then fewer and fewer as the minutes dragged on. The North Sea was 6 degrees above freezing. No human body could survive long. Even those who'd managed to grab floating wreckage were already numb, their limbs stiff, their breath slowing. From the bridge of Admiral Hipper, Captain Zursee Helmuth High watched silently. Smoke still poured from his own ship's hull, the long wound cut by the destroyer's ram flooding compartments below. His crew had damage control parties racing through the decks, sealing bulkheads and fighting fires. He should have been focused on survival. His own ship was in real danger, but High wasn't looking at the gauges or the reports. He was looking at the men in the water. His first officer approached, waiting for orders. Hay didn't hesitate. Stop engines. Lower boats. Rescue survivors. The officer blinked. Sir, the sea is rough. Rescue them, High repeated. His voice was quiet, final, and so the order went out. German sailors, many still shaken from battle, rushed to the rails, throwing ropes, life buoys, anything that would float. They lowered lifeboats and went out into the freezing water themselves, risking their own lives for the men who had tried to kill them minutes earlier. They pulled the first survivor aboard at 09:45, then another, and another. Some were unconscious, faces pale as marble. Some were crying. Some couldn't even speak, their mouths too cold to form words. But others looked up in disbelief, seeing the swastika flag flying above the ship that was now saving them. One British sailor later said, "We couldn't understand it. We thought they'd leave us, but they didn't." By the time the last man was hauled aboard, only 31 survivors remained from a crew of 149. Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roop was among them, barely. He had been thrown into the water when Glowworm capsized, fighting the waves as best he could. Somehow he had clung to a piece of floating debris long enough for the Germans to spot him. 2 sailors from Hipper hauled him up, soaked, bleeding, exhausted. When he reached the deck, those who saw him would never forget what happened next. The German crew, the very men whose ship he had rammed, stood at attention as he was carried aboard. Captain High came down from the bridge and met him personally. Accounts differ slightly on what was said, but the meaning never changed. Hay saluted him. He reportedly said something like, "You fought gallantly. You are a brave man." Roop, still coughing up seawater, tried to respond. Some said he simply nodded. Others recalled him whispering, "Thank you." He was given medical attention immediately, wrapped in blankets, and brought below. But the damage was too severe. He had lost too much blood. His lungs were full of seawater. By midday, Lieutenant Commander Roop, the man who had taken a destroyer into battle against a heavy cruiser, was dead. Captain High ordered that he be buried at sea with full naval honors. The German crew assembled on deck as his body, wrapped in the Union Jack, was committed to the ocean. The Kriegsmarine Band played solemnly as the North Sea took him. And then, in an act almost unthinkable amid the savagery of 1940, Hay sat down and wrote a letter. It was addressed to the British authorities, through the Red Cross. In it, he described the battle in full detail. He told them about Roop's bravery, about how Glowworm had fought against impossible odds, about the courage and composure of her captain and crew. He ended the letter with a statement that would echo through history. In my opinion, this officer and his ship fought in the most gallant manner possible. That letter, written by an enemy, carried across front lines, and verified by multiple sources, became one of the most remarkable documents of the war. When it reached Britain months later, Glowworm's loss was already known, but not the full story. The Admiralty had assumed the ship was simply missing. No witnesses, no reports. Just another destroyer gone silent in the North Sea. Then came High's letter. It stunned the Royal Navy. The account was so detailed, so vivid, that officials initially questioned its authenticity. But cross-referencing German and British records confirmed every word. In 1945, after the war, the testimony was reviewed again, this time in the light of peace. The conclusion was unanimous. For his actions that day, for engaging a superior enemy, protecting his fleet, and choosing to fight to the end, Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roop would be awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. It was the first VC of the Second World War to be recommended by the enemy, even in Germany. Captain High's respect for Roop became something of legend among naval officers. After the war, when he was interviewed, he still spoke of that morning with a kind of quiet reverence. He was a brave man, High said. A very brave man. I would have been proud to serve under him. For the men of Admiral Hipper, the memory never faded either. Years later, some of them would meet Glowworm's survivors, men they had pulled from the freezing sea. They shared drinks, photographs, even laughter. Old enemies bound forever by one impossible morning off the coast of Norway. And so, amid all the brutality of the Second World War, amid the bombings, the massacres, and the cruelty that would come, there was this. A battle fought between 2 ships, 2 captains, and 2 crews. One destroyed, one scarred, but both defined by something that outlived the war itself: respect. It said that as Admiral Hipper steamed away that day, Her crew stood silently on deck, watching the last traces of oil and debris fade into the mist. A single German officer was heard to mutter under his breath, "Verdammt tapfer," cursed brave. And in those two words, the truth of HMS Glowworm's final hour lived on. History remembers victories. It celebrates triumphs, medals, and the names of the ships that survived. But sometimes the greatest stories come from the ones that didn't. HMS Glowworm never returned home. She lies somewhere beneath the waves of the Norwegian Sea, a twisted relic of steel and salt, her decks now covered in silence and silt. But the sea that claimed her also carried her story farther than any ship could sail. Because what Gerard Roop and his crew did that morning wasn't about victory. It was about defiance. Every sailor aboard that ship knew the odds. They knew they couldn't win. And still, they fired, maneuvered, charged, not because they thought they would survive, but because it was their duty to try, to hold the line, to make the enemy bleed even in defeat. In the decades since, naval historians have often compared Glowworm's charge to other desperate last stands, the Hood, the Bismarck, even the Yamato. But those ships were giants. Glowworm was a destroyer barely over 100 meters long, and her story stands apart because it was so human. A single man making a single decision in the face of logic, fear, and inevitability. Roop's choice, to turn back for a lost sailor, to radio enemy sightings, to attack against impossible odds, and finally to ram a ship 10 times his size, wasn't a moment of madness. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that only appears when all other options are gone. When Admiral Hipper's captain wrote his letter of praise, he didn't just document an act of war, he preserved an act of humanity. An acknowledgement that courage can exist even in an enemy uniform. That somewhere beneath the flags and orders, there remains a shared understanding between men who risk everything at sea. That's what makes Glowworm's story different. It isn't about strategy. It isn't about power. It's about what people choose to do when the world collapses around them. The wreck of Glowworm was found decades later, her hull broken, her guns still trained toward the horizon. A quiet monument to those who refused to yield, and every time divers visit her remains, they find the same thing: silence. No movement, no life. Just a destroyer resting beneath the cold Norwegian waters, proud, defiant, and eternal. Somewhere in that silence, you can almost hear it. The roar of the guns, the crash of steel, the voice of a captain shouting, "Full speed ahead," a tin can against a steel monster. And for one brief, impossible moment, the tin can won. Thanks for watching PLZ. Subscribe my channel.